In an upscale restaurant nestled within Oakwood Estates, a young black law student working as a waiter was about to be humiliated in front of a room full of elites. What started as a quiet correction about pool hours spiraled when HOA President Karen Whitfield accused him of being aggressive and demanded he be fired. Marcus Johnson wasn't your typical server. For 3 years, he juggled fine dining shifts with law school lectures, known for his unshakable composure and a razor-sharp understanding of civil rights law. When Karen Whitfield called for his termination, claiming she felt threatened by his tone, she had no idea she was messing with someone who had the facts, the law, and a recording device on his side. Marcus responded not with outrage, but with measured legal precision that would ignite a chain reaction across the entire community. What began as a petty power trip would become the unraveling of a suburban queenpin. The bistro and Oakwood Estates would never forget the day Karen Whitfield got publicly, legally, and irrevocably clapped back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Crystal stemware caught the light of the bistro's elegant chandeliers, transforming ordinary beams into prismatic whispers across white linen tablecloths. Marcus Johnson balanced 3 plates along his left arm with practiced precision, his movements fluid and assured as he navigated between the closely set tables of the Friday evening rush. "Your grilled salmon with asparagus," he announced, setting the dish before an elderly woman with a warm smile. "And for you, sir, the filet mignon, medium rare." The final plate, a pan-seared scallop appetizer, he placed at the 3rd setting. "Can I get you anything else at the moment?" "Everything looks wonderful," the woman said, her eyes crinkling appreciatively. "Thank you, young man." Marcus nodded, his professional demeanor intact as he retreated with the same graceful economy of movement that characterized his service. He'd been at the bistro for nearly 2 years now, perfecting the delicate art of being present without being noticed, attentive without being intrusive. It was a skill that served him well both here and in the lecture halls of law school, where he'd learned to measure his words with the same precision he now measured the distance between water, glasses, and wine stems. Across the restaurant, another kind of performance unfolded. Karen Whitfield sat at the center of a table for 6, her platinum blonde bob catching the light as she leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to give her words an air of conspiracy, while ensuring they carried to those who mattered. "The Hendersons on Willow Lane haven't addressed those overgrown hedges, even after our second notice," she said, tapping a manicured nail against her water glass. "If they can't maintain basic standards, perhaps Oakwood isn't the right fit for them." James Patterson, seated to her right, nodded sagely. His silver hair and tailored blazer completed the picture of old money, though those who knew him well understood his fortune was barely a generation deep. "Property values don't maintain themselves," he agreed, swirling his bourbon. "That's why leadership matters." His gaze settled in Karen with naked admiration. Since taking over as HOA President 3 years ago, Karen had transformed Oakwood Estates from merely exclusive to militantly so. Marcus moved past their table, careful to maintain his invisible status as he refreshed water glasses at a neighboring foretop. He'd lived in Oakwood Estates since his aunt had invited him to stay in her guest house during law school, an arrangement that had raised eyebrows among certain residents who believed the service gate should be the only entry point for people who looked like him. "Marcus!" The sharp whisper cut through his thoughts. Shanice Williams, her braids pulled back into a practical ponytail, gestured urgently from near the service station. "I need backup at table 12. The gentleman seems to think his medium-well steak should be pink but not bloody, and now he's upset it's not rare enough." Marcus suppressed a sigh. "I've got you. Want me to grab a new one from the kitchen?" "Please," Shanice whispered, relief evident in her expression. Before he escalates to Diane. As if summoned by her name, Diane Chen emerged from the kitchen, her petite frame moving efficiently as she surveyed her domain. The bistro was her life's work, cultivated over 15 years from a modest cafe to the crown jewel of Oakwood Estates commercial district. She'd learned early that success meant navigating the invisible currents of power that flowed through the community, accommodating the whims of residents like Karen Whitfield while protecting her staff from their worst impulses. "Everything going smoothly?" she asked Marcus as he passed. "Just grabbing a replacement steak for table 12, he replied. "Shanice has it under control, but the gentleman is particular about his definition of medium well." Diane nodded, a flicker of resignation crossing her features. "The Patterson party has a wine order when you have a moment. Their usual Cabernet." Marcus understood the subtext. The Patterson party, meaning Karen Whitfield's table, took priority, regardless of what other tasks might be pressing. It wasn't a dynamic he appreciated, but it was one he understood. In the ecosystem of the bistro, certain patrons were apex predators. Across the room, Michael Okafor sat alone at a small table near the window, observing the subtle dance of service and status with quiet interest. As one of Oakwood's newest homeowners and one of its few black executives, he'd spent the past 3 months cataloging the community's unspoken hierarchies. He nodded at Marcus as their eyes briefly met, a small gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by Karen Whitfield, whose gaze narrowed slightly as it traveled between them. "Speaking of standards," Karen said, loud enough for her voice to carry as Michael walked past her table toward the restrooms, "we need to be vigilant about who purchases in Oakwood moving forward. The right sort of people understand the value of community cohesion." James Patterson chuckled to sound like ice cubes hitting an empty glass. "The vetting process does seem more relaxed than in previous years." Marcus, returning from the kitchen with the replacement steak, felt a familiar tightness in his jaw. It was the same tension he'd felt during his first-year property law class, when discussions of neighborhood character and property values served as thinly veiled proxies for exclusion. He'd learned to channel that tension into focus, another skill that served him well both at the bistro and in the mock courtroom. He delivered the steak to Shanice's table with a diplomatic explanation about the varying interpretations of cooking temperatures, smoothing the situation with practiced ease before turning his attention to Karen's wine order. As he approached their table, a distinguished older gentleman at an adjacent table caught his eye. "Young man," he called, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being heard in courtrooms. "When you have a moment." Diane materialized beside Marcus, her smile professional but her eyes alert. "Judge Reynolds, I hope everything is to your satisfaction this evening." Thomas Reynolds, his face lined with the wisdom of 70 years and 30 on the bench, nodded appreciatively. "Excellent as always, Diane. I simply wanted to compliment the service. This young man has been most attentive without being intrusive, a rare skill." Marcus felt Diane's subtle relief beside him. "Thank you, sir. Marcus is one of our finest. He's also in law school, Judge Reynolds, civil rights law." The judge's eyebrows rose with interest. "Is that so? We should chat sometime. Young man, the bench could use more minds with diverse perspectives." "Thank you, sir. I'd appreciate that," Marcus replied, aware of Karen Whitfield's gaze boring into his back from the next table. "Marcus, the wine," Diane murmured, guiding him back to his immediate duties. As he approached Karen's table with the requested Cabernet, he caught fragments of their conversation. "Pool will be available until midnight for our gathering tomorrow," Karen was saying, her authority evident in her tone. "I've already arranged it with maintenance. We want everyone to enjoy a proper evening without arbitrary restrictions." Marcus paused, bottle in hand. As a resident of Oakwood, albeit one who typically accessed community amenities during off-peak hours to avoid uncomfortable encounters, he knew the pool closed at 10 p.m. without exception, a rule Karen herself had championed after complaints about noise from younger residents. "Your Cabernet, ma'am," he said, presenting the bottle for her inspection. Karen barely glanced at the label before nodding. "Fine." Her dismissal was immediate, her attention already returning to her companions. "As I was saying, I've ensured we'll have exclusive access until midnight. One of the benefits of leadership." Marcus poured with precision, careful not to spill a drop on the pristine tablecloth. The pool hours were a small matter, but the casual way Karen bent rules she enforced on others nonetheless sparked a familiar sensation in his chest. The same feeling that had driven him toward law school in the first place. The front door of The bistro opened, admitting a gust of evening air and a young woman whose confident stride faltered slightly as she scanned the room. Her dark blonde hair fell in waves around a face that held echoes of Karen's features, softened by youth and, perhaps, a different outlook. Zoe Whitfield spotted her mother's table and approached with the resigned air of someone fulfilling an obligation. "You're late," Karen observed as her daughter reached the table. "We've already ordered." "Sorry, Mom. Study group ran long." Zoe slipped into an empty chair, nodding politely to the table's other occupants. "Hi, Mr. Patterson." Marcus moved smoothly to her side. "Good evening, miss. Can I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" Zoe looked up with a smile that contained something like apology. "Just water for now, thanks, and maybe a recommendation. I haven't been here in ages." "The chef's special tonight is herb-crusted halibut," Marcus suggested. "It's excellent. Perfect. I'll have that," Zoe said, handing back the menu he'd offered without opening it. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, a mundane moment that nonetheless drew Karen's sharp attention. "Zoe, you might want to consider all your options before deciding," Karen said, her tone light but her eyes fixed on Marcus with thinly veiled disapproval. "I trust his recommendation, Mom," Zoe replied with the subtle defiance of someone who had learned to pick her battles. As Marcus turned to place the order, he heard Karen resume her discussion about the pool hours for tomorrow's gathering. The incorrect information needled at him. A small injustice, perhaps, but one that reflected the larger patterns that shaped life at Oakwood Estates. For now, he tucked the observation away, focusing instead on the immediate demands of the evening rush. The restaurant continued its elegant hum of activity, crystal and silver catching the light, conversations rising and falling like the tide. On the surface, it was simply another busy Friday at the bistro. But beneath that polished veneer, invisible currents were shifting, drawing together a confluence of personalities and principles that would soon transform this ordinary evening into something altogether different. Marcus returned to Karen's table, halibut perfectly plated and steaming gently as he set it before Zoe. The conversation around the table had grown more animated, with Karen's voice rising slightly above the restaurant's gentle ambient noise. "As I was explaining," Karen continued, barely acknowledging Marcus's presence, "I've already coordinated with the maintenance staff. The pool will remain open until midnight for our little soiree tomorrow. We're expecting about 30 guests, so I've arranged for extra towels as well." "That sounds lovely, Karen," one of the women at the table remarked. "Will there be lifeguards on duty that late?" Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Hardly necessary. We're all adults capable of swimming responsibly." Marcus hesitated, the serving tray tucked under his arm. As a resident of Oakwood Estates, he knew the rigid pool policies intimately. Karen herself had championed stricter enforcement just last summer, after complaining about certain elements using the facilities unsupervised. The midnight extension she described wasn't merely improbable, it was impossible under the HOA's own regulations. "Is there something else you need?" Karen asked, her tone sharpening as she noticed Marcus hadn't departed. "I apologize for the interruption," Marcus said carefully, his voice measured and professional. "I just wanted to mention that the community pool closes at 10 p.m. without exception, according to the updated HOA regulations from last summer. The system automatically locks the gates and deactivates keycards after hours." A sudden stillness fell over the table. The clink of silverware against china from surrounding tables seemed to grow louder in the abrupt silence. "Excuse me?" Karen's voice dropped an octave, a danger sign that her dinner companions recognized immediately. Marcus maintained his professional composure. "I only mentioned it because I live in Oakwood Estates as well, and I wouldn't want your guests to be disappointed tomorrow evening if they planned on swimming after 10 p.m. The automatic lockout can't be overridden without maintenance filing special paperwork with the county at least 3 business days in advance." Karen's face flushed, color rising from her neck to her hairline. "You think I don't know the policies of my own HOA?" "Not at all, ma'am. You simply what?" Karen's voice rose sharply. "Decided to contradict me in front of my guests? Question my authority as president of the Homeowners Association? James Patterson set down his wine glass with deliberate care. "I think the young man might be confused about his position here," he said, his patrician features arranged in an expression of practiced concern. "Both his position at this establishment and within our community." Marcus felt the familiar burn of indignation rise in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. "Sir, I meant no disrespect. I was simply clarifying a factual matter about pool hours." "Factual matter?" Karen's laugh held no humor. "And since when does the waitstaff determine what is factual at this table?" Zoe sank lower in her chair, her face burning with embarrassment. "Mom, he was just trying to be helpful," she murmured, but her voice barely carried over her mother's. Rising indignation. "Helpful would be refilling our water glasses, not inserting himself into our private conversation." Karen snapped, her gaze never leaving Marcus. "I've lived in Oakwood Estates for 14 years. I wrote half of the current HOA bylaws. I hardly need a server to educate me on community regulations." The pause before the word server carried volumes of subtext, and Marcus wasn't the only one who caught it. At a nearby table, Thomas Reynolds lowered his menu, his attention now fully directed toward the unfolding scene. "I apologize if I overstepped," Marcus said, his voice calm despite his quickening pulse. "I only meant to provide helpful information." "If I want information," Karen said icily, "I certainly wouldn't seek it from someone carrying plates for a living." Zoe's eyes widened. "Mom!" James leaned forward, emboldened by Karen's open hostility. "Perhaps in the future you might remember that staff should know their place. Unless, of course, the bistro has changed its service standards without informing its patrons." The word place hung in the air like a slap. 2 tables away, Michael Okafor set down his fork, no longer pretending not to listen. "Is everything all right here?" Shanice approached the table, having noticed the escalating tension from across the room. Her expression was professionally concerned, but her eyes met Marcus's briefly in silent solidarity. "No, everything is not all right," Karen declared, her voice now carrying throughout the dining room. "This waiter has been unspeakably rude and confrontational. He contradicted me, argued with me, in front of my guests. I want to speak to Diane immediately." "Ms. Chen is handling a situation in the kitchen, but I'd be happy to—" "Immediately," Karen repeated, cutting Shanice off with a sharp gesture. "This level of service is completely unacceptable. He's been aggressive and incompetent all evening." The accusation of aggression, that particular word choice, sent a chill down Marcus's spine. In his 26 years, he'd learned exactly how dangerous such characterizations could be when applied to someone who looked like him. It wasn't merely an exaggeration, it was a weapon. "I assure you, I've made every effort to provide excellent service," Marcus said, his law school training kicking in as he chose his words with precision. "If I've fallen short in any way, I sincerely apologize." "An apology doesn't erase the fact that you deliberately undermined me," Karen insisted, her voice rising further. "Do you have any idea who I am in this community?" Marcus stood perfectly still, aware that every eye in the restaurant was now on him. The weight of these moments pressed against his chest, the familiar, suffocating pressure of having to modulate every expression, measure every word, lest he confirm the dangerous stereotypes that people like Karen were all too ready to apply. "Yes, ma'am. I'm aware you're the HOA president," he acknowledged calmly. "And yet you still thought it appropriate to correct me? To suggest I don't know my own community's rules?" Karen's hand trembled slightly as she gripped her water glass. "This is exactly the kind of disrespect that's becoming all too common. People who haven't earned their place trying to dictate to those who have." James nodded in vigorous agreement. "It's a pattern, unfortunately. Standards slipping everywhere you look." At a nearby table, Judge Reynolds set down his napkin and began to rise, but before he could intervene, Zoe spoke up, her voice wavering. "Mom, please stop. He was just trying to help. This is embarrassing." Karen turned to her daughter, genuinely shocked by the betrayal. "Embarrassing? What's embarrassing is having our evening disrupted by someone who clearly doesn't understand proper service etiquette." "There's nothing improper about what he did," Zoe insisted, though her voice remained quiet. "He was being courteous. I will not be lectured on courtesy by my own daughter, Karen snapped, then turned back to Marcus. With renewed vigor, I want to speak to Diane. Now. She needs to know that her establishment is being undermined by staff who think they can challenge paying customers. As if summoned by the tension crackling through the dining room, Diane emerged from the kitchen, her expression shifting from professional warmth to cautious concern as she registered the unmistakable atmosphere of conflict. She moved swiftly toward Karen's table, intercepting Shanice, who whispered a quick brief of the situation. I want this man removed from our table immediately, Karen declared as Diane approached, her finger jabbing in Marcus's direction. His behavior has been completely unacceptable. Aggressive, confrontational, incompetent. The word aggressive landed again, sharper this time. Around the restaurant, conversations had ceased entirely as diners watched the scene unfold. Michael Okafor had set his napkin aside, his posture alert and attentive. Judge Reynolds remained half-risen from his seat, his weathered face set in lines of concern. He made me feel uncomfortable, Karen continued, her voice carrying theatrical vulnerability now. The way he loomed over our table, contradicting me, inserting himself into our private conversations. Marcus stood perfectly still, his servers, mask firmly in place despite the storm of emotions behind it. He'd weathered variations of this scene before. The sudden transformation of his tall frame from impressive to intimidating. His articulate speech from well-spoken to argumentative, his presence from attentive to aggressive, all with the utterance of a few carefully chosen words. People like him, James added with practiced concern, need to understand there are consequences for this kind of behavior. The phrase people like him hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Zoe slumped further into her chair, her face burning with mortification and growing anger. I want him fired, Karen stated flatly, looking directly at Diane now. Immediately. Otherwise, I'll be forced to reconsider whether the bistro is an appropriate venue for Oakwood residents to patronize. Diane's expression revealed nothing as she looked between Karen and Marcus, caught in the impossible triangle between customer appeasement, employee loyalty, and her own ethical compass. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which point of that triangle would break first. Diane Chen's smile remained perfectly in place, though it no longer reached her eyes. 15 years of restaurant management had taught her the delicate art of de-escalation, but something in Karen's tone, in the naked entitlement of her demand, struck a dissonant chord. Mrs. Whitfield, Diane began, her voice pitched low and soothing. I understand you're upset. Why don't we discuss this privately? Marcus is one of our most valued servers, but I'm happy to have Shanice take over your table for the remainder of your meal. Karen's eyes narrowed. That's not an acceptable solution. This isn't about who brings our food. This is about maintaining standards. She glanced around the restaurant, aware of the audience she now commanded. The bistro used to be a respectable establishment where certain behaviors weren't tolerated. I assure you we maintain the highest standards of service, Diane replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. Marcus has an exemplary record. Clearly your definition of exemplary has changed, James Patterson interjected, swirling his wine with theatrical disdain. When staff begin to think they can correct patrons, particularly patrons of our standing, something has gone terribly wrong with management. Marcus stood silently, his body still but his mind racing. Years of law school debates and moot court competitions had honed his ability to think strategically under pressure. This moment was rapidly transforming from a routine customer dispute into something far more dangerous. He recognized the escalation pattern all too well. The casual condescension shifting to open hostility, the emphasis on standing and standards. The subtle but unmistakable othering that separated people like him from people like Karen and James. With a practiced motion that appeared to be nothing more than adjusting his stance, Marcus slipped his phone from his pocket and pressed record, positioning it partially concealed by his serving tray. Mr. Patterson, Diane said, I can assure you that the bistro values all our customers. If you prefer, I can personally oversee your table for the remainder of your meal. That misses the point entirely, Karen cut in sharply. This isn't about Service now. It's about accountability. This young man deliberately undermined my authority in front of my guests. He needs to face consequences. From his nearby table, Thomas Reynolds cleared his throat. If I might interject, with all due respect, Judge Reynolds, Karen interrupted, barely glancing in his direction. This doesn't concern you. This is between me and the management regarding an employee who has overstepped his boundaries. Thomas raised an eyebrow but fell silent, his expression hardening as he observed Karen's dismissal. Marcus watched the interaction with heightened awareness, noting how easily Karen dismissed even someone of Thomas's stature when it conflicted with her narrative. He kept his phone recording, careful to maintain its concealment while capturing the exchange. Mrs. Whitfield, Diane tried again, I understand your concern, but terminating an employee on the spot for providing information, even if that information was unwelcome, seems disproportionate. Disproportionate? Karen's voice rose again. What's disproportionate is how quickly standards collapse when you start hiring people who don't understand their proper role. People who think living in our community on some technicality gives them the right to speak, as if they belong. The mask had slipped entirely now. Around the restaurant, several diners shifted uncomfortably. Michael Okafor, without any attempt at concealment, raised his own phone and began openly recording the scene. Look around you, Karen continued, gesturing expansively. The bistro has been the crown jewel of Oakwood Estates for years. Do you want to become just another restaurant that caters to anyone with a credit card, where people like him think they can lecture people like us? Zoe slouched lower in her chair, her face a mask of mortification. Mom, please stop, she whispered. I will not stop, Karen replied sharply. This is exactly the problem with your generation, Zoe. You don't understand that maintaining certain standards requires vigilance. People like him, her hand waved dismissively toward Marcus, are precisely why property values become unstable. They change the character of a community. The phrase hung in the air, its implication impossible to misconstrue. Diane's professional smile vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of genuine shock. Even James Patterson seemed momentarily taken aback by Karen's explicit statement. Marcus felt a familiar cold clarity settle over him, the same focused calm that descended during critical law school examinations. With deliberate care, he shifted his phone to ensure it captured Karen's words clearly. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, his voice measured and surprisingly steady. I believe there may be a misunderstanding about several points that I'd like to clarify, if I may. Karen's eyes widened at his audacity. You don't have permission to speak. I'm addressing management. Actually, Marcus continued calmly, as both a party to this conversation and an employee currently being discussed, I have certain rights that remain intact regardless of your preferred conversational structure. The sudden shift in his language, from deferential server to articulate professional, caused a subtle ripple through the restaurant. Thomas Reynolds leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. How dare you? Karen sputtered. This is exactly the kind of insubordination. Respectfully, Mrs. Whitfield, Marcus continued, his tone remaining even. Insubordination implies a hierarchical relationship between us that doesn't legally exist. As a server at the bistro, I report to Ms. Chen, not to patrons. While customer satisfaction is our priority, that doesn't establish an employer-employee relationship between us. James Patterson set down his wine glass, with enough force to slosh liquid onto the white tablecloth. Young man, you are wildly out of line. On the contrary, sir, Marcus replied, his gaze steady. I'm attempting to establish the actual lines that govern this interaction. When Mrs. Whitfield demands my termination based on providing factual information about pool hours, information that, as a resident of Oakwood Estates, I am both privy to and affected by, she isn't merely expressing dissatisfaction with service. She's attempting to exercise authority she doesn't possess. Karen's face flushed with anger. Diane, are you going to allow this behavior to continue? He's arguing with customers now. I'm not arguing, Mrs. Whitfield, I'm clarifying, Marcus said before Diane could respond. Just as I clarified the pool hours, which incidentally, you established and vigorously enforced last summer after complaints about the Morales family's teenage children using the pool until 10:30 p.m. The HOA minutes from July 15th documented your specific comment that strict closing times protect property values and community standards. Karen's mouth opened and closed without sound, momentarily stymied by his detailed recall. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his law student training now fully evident, your suggestion that I don't belong in this community on some technicality and your reference to people like him in the context of property values potentially constitutes discriminatory language under California civil rights statutes. The restaurant had fallen completely silent. Even kitchen noise seemed to have ceased, as if the entire establishment held its collective breath. Are you threatening me? Karen finally managed, her voice rising to a near shriek. Not at all, Marcus replied calmly. I'm simply providing information, exactly as I did regarding the pool hours. Information about applicable laws is factual, not threatening. Michael Okafor's phone remained raised, capturing every word of the exchange. Across the restaurant, several other diners had discreetly begun recording as well. Ms. Chen, Marcus continued, turning slightly toward Diane while keeping Karen in his peripheral vision. Restaurant policy states that all employees must provide accurate information to patrons when relevant to their dining experience or community events hosted at the bistro. Section 3.4 of the Employee Handbook specifically notes that staff should politely clarify any misinformation that might impact patron satisfaction or event planning. I was following established protocol. Diane stared at Marcus with newfound appreciation, clearly surprised by both his command of restaurant policy and his composed articulation under pressure. This is absurd, Karen sputtered, looking to James for support. He's twisting everything around. Using fancy words doesn't change the fact that he was rude and aggressive. Mrs. Whitfield, Marcus said, his voice softening slightly, I've maintained a professional demeanor throughout our interaction. I've spoken in measured tones without raising my voice. I haven't gestured emphatically or entered your personal space. By any objective standard, my behavior has been neither rude nor aggressive. Your characterization of it as such relies on subjective interpretations that, when examined alongside your comments about people like me and community character, raise concerning questions about the basis of your perception. A soft murmur rippled through the restaurant as diners processed his eloquent response. Thomas Reynolds nodded almost imperceptibly, approval evident in his expression. I don't have to listen to this, Karen declared, throwing her napkin onto the table. Diane, I'll ask you one final time. Will you fire this man, or will the bistro lose the patronage of Oakwood's board members? The moment hung suspended, a perfect crystallization of the choice that Diane, and by extension the whole community, now faced. Continue accommodating prejudice for the sake of peace and profit, or stand firm against it despite the cost. Marcus remained perfectly still, his phone still recording as he waited for Diane's response. He had said all he needed to say, had strategically established the factual and legal framework of the situation. Now came the moment of reckoning. The silence stretched taut as piano wire, the entire restaurant collectively holding its breath. The suspended silence lasted 3 heartbeats before it was broken by a single, deliberate sound, the slow clap of Thomas Reynolds' hands. The retired judge rose fully from his seat, his tall frame commanding attention as he continued his measured applause. Exceptional command of both fact and law, young man, he said, his judicial voice carrying effortlessly across the hushed restaurant. Precisely the kind of measured response we need more of in our justice system. Michael Okafor joined the applause, next, still holding his phone with one hand while clapping with the other. One by one, other diners followed suit. Tentatively at first, then with growing conviction as the tide of public opinion crystallized before their eyes. Karen's face contorted in disbelief as she glanced around the restaurant, watching as even several other HOA members at nearby tables joined the spontaneous show of support. Her carefully cultivated sphere of influence was disintegrating in real time. Diane Chen straightened her shoulders, drawing herself up to her full height, modest in inches but suddenly formidable in presence. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Marcus is one of our most valued employees. Not only will he not be fired, but I want to personally commend him for handling the situation with exceptional professionalism." She paused, meeting Karen's gaze directly. "Oh, if our standards don't meet your expectations, you are certainly welcome to dine elsewhere in the future." The applause crescendoed. Karen's mouth opened in shock, her carefully maintained composure crumbling at the edges as she realized how completely she had lost control of the situation. "This is outrageous," she sputtered, looking desperately to James Patterson for support. "Do you have any idea how much business the HOA brings to this establishment? The fundraisers we host here? The connections we provide?" James rose to his feet, his face flushed with indignation and too much wine. "This is nothing short of reverse discrimination," he declared, jabbing a finger in Marcus's direction. "A valued customer expresses a reasonable concern and suddenly she's the villain? Because this server has weaponized politically correct language against her?" His words fell flat in the charged atmosphere, the dated terminology of reverse discrimination, striking most listeners as a relic from another era. Even several of Karen's allies at the table shifted uncomfortably, physically distancing themselves from her and James's stance. "Dad, that's not helping," a voice called from across the restaurant. A middle-aged man at another table, James's son, Marcus realized, shook his head in dismay. "Just stop." Zoe pushed back from the table suddenly, standing with tears glimmering in her eyes. "I want to apologize," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "What happened here tonight was inexcusable." She turned to her mother. "Mom, you were wrong, completely wrong." "Zoe," Karen hissed, reaching for her daughter's arm. "Sit down immediately." Zoe stepped back, evading her mother's grasp. "No. I've sat quietly through too many of these moments, not anymore." She turned again to Marcus. "I'm sorry, truly." The simple, direct apology, delivered publicly and without qualification, created a palpable shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. It wasn't just the drama of family discord, it was the symbolic weight of the younger generation explicitly rejecting the values of the old. Shanice approached Marcus discreetly, keeping her voice low. "I've got a recording too," she murmured. "And I've already texted the link to your phone. Backup, just in case." Marcus nodded slightly in acknowledgement, realizing that Shanice had recognized what was happening long before he had started recording himself. Her foresight didn't surprise him. She had navigated these waters far longer than he had. Karen rose from her chair, gathering her purse with trembling hands. "This entire situation has been deliberately manipulated," she announced, her voice straining for its usual authority but wavering at the edges. "The bistro can expect to hear from my attorney, and the HOA board will certainly be reconsidering our relationship with this establishment." "Actually, Karen," Thomas Reynolds interjected mildly, "as you know, I sit on that board as well. I believe we'll be having a different conversation entirely at our next meeting." For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Karen's face, the realization that this incident wouldn't remain contained within the bistro's walls, that the video evidence, the multiple witnesses, and the public nature of her comments would follow her back into the community where she had built her kingdom. "James," she said sharply, "we're leaving." James Patterson drained his wine glass in one defiant gulp before following Karen, pausing only to drop his napkin onto his half-eaten meal with theatrical disgust. "My family has been part of Oakwood Estates since its founding," he announced, to no one in particular. "This community has standards, traditions, values that are clearly no longer being respected. Perhaps it's time for new ones." Michael Okafor replied calmly from his table, phone still in hand. Karen stalked toward the exit, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. James followed, maintaining his indignant posture, even as he slightly weaved from the evening's alcohol consumption. At the door, Karen turned for one final salvo. "This isn't over," she called, her voice carrying the practiced threat of someone accustomed to wielding power. Not by a long shot. The door swung shut behind them and a collective breath seemed to release throughout the restaurant. Conversations resumed, though in hushed, urgent tones as diners processed what they had witnessed. Several people approached, their server to discreetly request their checks, eager to leave and share the evening's events. Zoe remained standing by the table, suddenly alone and uncertain. The other HOA members who had been dining with Karen had taken the opportunity to quietly distance themselves, some leaving cash for their portions and slipping away, others moving to different tables with murmured excuses. "I should go," Zoe said to no one in particular, her voice small. Marcus, who had been quietly conferring with Diane, noticed Zoe's isolation. Despite everything that had just transpired, he felt a surprising surge of compassion for her position. "Your meal," he said, gesturing to her untouched halibut. "Would you like it packaged to take with you?" Zoe looked up, surprise and gratitude flashing across her features. "You'd still? After all this?" "It's not the fish's fault," Marcus replied with a small smile, the first crack in his professional demeanor, revealing a glimpse of the person beneath. A watery laugh escaped Zoe. "Yes, please, thank you." As Marcus moved toward the kitchen to arrange for the to-go container, Thomas Reynolds approached him, hand extended. "Marcus Johnson," the judge said, shaking his hand firmly. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced, though Diane mentioned you're in law school." "Yes, sir. 3rd year at UC Davis, focusing on civil rights law." Thomas nodded approvingly. "I'd like to continue this conversation sometime. My chambers are always open to minds like yours." He glanced toward the door where Karen had made her exit. "And I suspect the community could use your perspective in the days ahead." Diane approached, relief evident in her expression now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Marcus, take the rest of the night off. With pay, of course." "That's not necessary," he began. "It absolutely is," she insisted. "What happened tonight?" She shook her head, searching for words. "I should have handled things differently from the beginning. I've let too many smaller moments slide in the name of business." The admission clearly cost her, and Marcus recognized it as the beginning of a more complicated reckoning, not just for Diane, but for the entire community that the bistro served. Shanice appeared at his elbow, her expression a mixture of concern and excitement. "Your video already has 17 shares in the Oakwood Residents group," she said quietly. And Michael Okafor just posted his with a pretty powerful caption about witnessing the moment Oakwood Estates decided what kind of community it wants to be. The implications washed over Marcus in a wave. What had begun as a simple correction about pool hours had transformed into something far larger, a catalyst forcing an entire community to confront the subtle, and not so subtle, prejudices it had harbored beneath its manicured surface. "What happens now?" Diane asked, her question encompassing far more than just the remainder of the evening's service. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket, the weight of the recorded evidence suddenly feeling both powerful and dangerous. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, "but I think that's going to depend on a lot more people than just us." Across the restaurant, conversations continued in urgent whispers. Phones illuminated faces as messages flew from the bistro to homes throughout Oakwood Estates, and the evening's events began their transformation from isolated incident to community reckoning. The video was already spreading, carrying with it not just the record of what had transpired, but the implicit question of what would follow. For Marcus, the immediate crisis had passed, but as he caught sight of his reflection in the restaurant's window, composed, dignified, yet carrying the weight of something much larger than himself, he understood that the true aftermath was only beginning to unfold. 200,000 views, Aunt Vivian said, setting her tablet on the kitchen table. And that's just on the primary upload. The reposts and reaction videos are pushing it well into the millions. Marcus rubbed his temples, the weight of 3 sleepless nights evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. What had begun as a local incident had exploded into a viral phenomenon that extended far beyond Oakwood Estates. National news outlets had picked up the story, dubbing Karen the bistro bigot in splashy headlines that reduced the complex situation to clickbait simplicity. "I never wanted this kind of attention," he said quietly. Vivian Johnson straightened. Her blazer, the habit of a woman who had spent 3 decades presenting herself impeccably in courtrooms, where her very presence had once been considered an anomaly. As one of the first black female partners at her civil rights firm, she understood, better than most, the double-edged sword of public exposure. "What you wanted and what happened are 2 different matters," she said, her tone gentle but direct. "The question now is what you do with the platform you've been given." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of Vivian's guest house, where Marcus had lived since starting law school. It was a small but elegant structure at the edge of her property in Oakwood Estates, a property that had raised eyebrows when she'd purchased it 15 years earlier, fresh off a landmark discrimination settlement that had made her firm's reputation. "I've had 7 requests for interviews," Marcus said, scrolling through his email. 3 law firms offering to represent me in a discrimination suit against Karen Whitfield and the HOA, and my constitutional law professor wants me to present the case study to our class next week. Vivian considered her nephew thoughtfully. "What do you want, Marcus? Not what everyone else wants from you. What do you actually want to come of this?" The question hung in the air as Marcus contemplated his answer. 3 days ago, his goals had been clear: finish law school, pass the bar, join a firm where he could make a difference. Now, suddenly, he found himself at the center of exactly the kind of case he had hoped to someday litigate. "I want change that lasts," he said finally. "Not just Karen being humiliated or making some forced apology. I want Oakwood to actually confront what happened, what's been happening for years to people who don't fit their preferred resident profile." A notification pinged on his phone. Another message from Michael Okafor, who had reached out repeatedly since the incident. Marcus opened it to find a link to a private meeting invitation. "The HOA board has called an emergency session for tomorrow evening," he read aloud. "Michael says Thomas Reynolds is pushing for Karen's removal as president, effective immediately." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Thomas Reynolds is finally finding his backbone. Interesting." She sipped her coffee, considering the implications. "He's been quietly uncomfortable with Karen's leadership for years, but never enough to actually challenge her." "Until now," Marcus added. "Until you forced his hand," Vivian corrected. "By standing your ground with dignity instead of either lashing out or backing down, you gave Thomas and others like him the perfect opportunity to finally take a side without feeling they were being extreme." Marcus's phone buzzed again, his 3rd case study reading assignment of the day automatically downloading. The ping reminded him that beyond the drama consuming Oakwood Estates, he still had papers due, exams to study for, and a legal career to prepare for. "How do I balance all this?" he asked, the question directed as much to himself as to his aunt. Vivian's expression softened. "One day at a time, one decision at a time, starting with what you'll do about the community meeting that's surely coming." Across Oakwood Estates, in the meticulously decorated sunroom of her Georgian-style home, Karen Whitfield sat surrounded by printouts of social media posts, her face tight with controlled fury as James Patterson paced before her. "The narrative is completely distorted," James insisted, jabbing at one of the papers. "They've edited that video to make you appear biased when you were simply advocating for community standards." Karen's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. She hadn't slept properly in days, jolting awake from dreams of public humiliation, of pointing fingers and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. "The HOA bylaws are clear," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of phone calls to allies. "As president, I can only be removed by a 2/3 majority vote following formal proceedings. Thomas doesn't have the votes." "He's working on it," James replied grimly. "He and that new resident, Okafor, have been making rounds, showing the video, soliciting statements from other minorities in the community about patterns of exclusion." His face twisted in disgust around the phrase. "What patterns? This community has never discriminated against qualified buyers." James gave her a long look. "Karen, we both know there's been discretion in how applications are processed. Nothing illegal, just careful consideration of cultural fit. The unspoken reality hung between them. The coincidental delays in processing applications from certain buyers, the suddenly discovered paperwork issues that extended closing periods until more suitable offers materialized, the subtle pressure on realtors to direct specific demographics elsewhere. None of that is relevant to what happened at the bistro, Karen insisted, though uncertainty flickered beneath her words. I was disrespected by waitstaff who overstepped their position. The fact that he happened to be black doesn't make my complaint racist. Of course not, James agreed quickly. That's exactly the point we need to emphasize. You were objecting to his behavior, not his identity. Karen nodded, clinging to this framing like a life raft. I've already spoken with Patricia at the local paper. She's agreed to run my statement about being unfairly portrayed and the harassment I've experienced since. James paused his pacing. Harassment? The phone calls, the people driving by the house, the way Melissa Tanner pretended not to see me at the market yesterday. Karen's voice rose slightly. I'm being treated like I'm the criminal here when I was the one attacked in that restaurant. James nodded sympathetically, though a flicker of doubt crossed his features. We'll need witnesses who support your version of events. Who else was at the table that evening who would be willing to make a statement? Karen's gaze dropped to her hands. I've reached out to everyone. Jeffrey has a sudden business trip. Margaret isn't returning my calls. And the others. She trailed, off, the implication clear. Cowards, James muttered. The moment there's any controversy, they scatter like leaves. Neither mentioned the most painful absence. Zoe, who had packed a bag the morning after the incident and gone to stay with a college friend, ignoring her mother's increasingly desperate calls and texts. The doorbell chimed, interrupting their strategy session. Karen moved to the window and peered out, her expression hardening as she recognized the delivery person. Another one, she said tightly, watching as the courier left a manila envelope on the doorstep. That's the third today. James retrieved the envelope, opening it in the foyer before returning to the sunroom. It's a formal notice of the emergency. HOA meeting, he reported. Tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. at the community center. The board will review the incident and consider. He paused, scanning further down the page. Consider a motion of no confidence in your leadership. Karen's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. They can't do this. I've given everything to this community. I've protected our values, our investments, our way of life. We'll fight it, James promised, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. We still have allies on the board, and we have the procedural rules on our side. Karen wasn't listening. She had returned to the window, staring out at the immaculate neighborhood she had helped shape. The manicured lawns, the regulated paint colors, the tasteful holiday decorations permitted during designated seasons. Her kingdom, built through 1,000 small exercises of control, now threatening to slip from her grasp because of one encounter with a waiter who had refused to stay in his prescribed place. This isn't just about me, she said softly. If they can do this to me, everything we've built here starts to unravel. James didn't disagree. The bistro was experiencing the strangest week in its 15-year history. The dining room oscillated between completely full, curious patrons drawn by the controversy, and nearly empty during hours when Karen's supporters typically dined. Online, the restaurant's review pages had become a battleground, with one-star reviews claiming hostile service and political atmosphere, countered by 5-star ratings applauding standing up against discrimination. Diane sat in her small office, phone pressed to her ear as she listened to yet another angry caller. I understand your concerns, she said mechanically, the phrase worn smooth from repetition. No, I have no plans to terminate Marcus's employment. Yes, I consider the matter closed from our perspective. She hung up and sighed, running her hands through her normally immaculate hair, now showing signs of neglect. The confrontation she had avoided for years, between her business interests and her personal ethics, had finally arrived, forcing her to choose sides in a way she had always carefully circumvented. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Shanice, stood in the doorway, her expression serious. "Got a minute?" she asked. Diane gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Of course. Is everything all right with tonight's service?" Shanice sat, her usual energetic demeanor subdued. "Service is fine, but we need to talk about what happens next." She leaned forward, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This isn't new, Diane. What happened to Marcus? It's just the first time someone recorded it. The first time it couldn't be ignored." Diane's gaze dropped to her desk. "I know." "Do you?" Shanice pressed. "Because I've worked here 8 years, and I could tell you a dozen stories about comments from Karen and her friends, about tables that request different servers when they're assigned to me, about tips that disappear when the patron realizes I'm the one who served them." The quiet accusation hung in the air. Diane had known, had seen, and had chosen the path of least resistance. "I thought I was protecting everyone's interests," Diane said softly. "Keeping the peace meant keeping the business afloat, which meant everyone kept their jobs." "At what cost?" Shanice asked. Before Diane could answer, her phone rang again. This time with a number she recognized. She answered on speaker. "Michael, thank you for calling back." "Diane," Michael Okafor's measured voice filled the small office. "I wanted to update you personally. The HOA has scheduled an emergency meeting for tomorrow evening. Given the bistro's central role in this situation, your presence would be valuable, if you're comfortable attending." Diane met Shanice's gaze. "I'll be there." "Excellent, and is Marcus working tonight? I've been trying to reach him." "He's taken a few days off," Diane replied. "The attention has been overwhelming." Michael's voice softened with understanding. "Of course. When you speak with him, please let him know I'd like to connect him with some colleagues of mine, legal professionals who specialize in community discrimination cases, not necessarily to pursue action, but to ensure he has proper advisors during this process." After the call ended, Shanice fixed Diane with a steady look. "So what happens now?" "With the bistro, I mean." Diane straightened in her chair, a decision crystallizing after days of uncertainty. "Now we stop pretending neutrality is an option. I've been so focused on not taking sides that I failed to see how that silence was itself a choice. The wrong one." She pulled a notepad toward her and began writing rapidly. "We're implementing formal anti-discrimination policies for staff and customers. Clear reporting procedures, consequences for violations, the works." She glanced up at Shanice. "I'd like your help developing these if you're willing. Your perspective would be invaluable." For the first time in days, Shanice smiled. About time. The sun was setting over Oakwood Estates when Zoe Whitfield parked her car outside a modest townhouse on the community's eastern edge. She sat for a moment, gathering her courage before approaching the door and knocking tentatively. Marcus opened it, surprise evident on his tired face. "Zoe?" "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," she said, words tumbling out nervously. "But I needed to talk to you, away from the restaurant, away from everyone else's opinions and cameras and agendas." After a moment's hesitation, Marcus stepped aside. "Come in." He led her to a small living room where textbooks and legal pads covered every surface, evidence of a student trying to maintain academic normalcy amid chaos. Zoe perched awkwardly on the edge of a chair, hands twisting in her lap. "I moved out," she said abruptly. "Not permanently, maybe, but I couldn't stay there listening to her convince herself she's the victim in all this. Watching her and Mr. Patterson strategize about how to discredit you." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm sorry, not just for what happened at the restaurant, but for all the times I sat quietly while comments were made. About staff, about neighbors, about maintaining community standards. I knew what those words really meant, and I said nothing." Marcus studied her carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm trying to figure out what to do next," Zoe admitted. "Mom wants me to stand with her at the HOA meeting tomorrow, to present this united family front like her values are my values." She shook her head. "But they're not. They never really have been, but I've been too cowardly to say so." And now? Now I don't know what to do. Publicly opposing her feels like betrayal, but supporting her feels like betraying myself. She gestured helplessly. I don't expect you to solve my moral dilemma. I guess I wanted you to know that what happened is forcing a lot of people in Oakwood to make choices they've been avoiding for a long time. Marcus was quiet for a moment, weighing his response. Including me, he finally said. I have to decide whether to pursue legal action, whether to use this platform I've suddenly been given, whether to focus on systemic change or personal accountability. What are you going to do? Zoe asked. I'm still figuring that out, Marcus admitted. But I know whatever happens next has to lead to real change, not just public shaming and then back to business as usual. Zoe nodded slowly. The HOA meeting tomorrow will be a turning point, Marcus finished. For your mother, for me, for Oakwood Estates. Outside, the streetlights of Oakwood Estates flickered on, illuminating manicured sidewalks and regulated mailboxes. Inside homes throughout the community, residents prepared for an unprecedented confrontation with the comfortable illusions many had maintained about their exclusive enclave, illusions that could no longer withstand the harsh light of recorded evidence and public scrutiny. The stage was set for a community reckoning that would force everyone to decide what kind of neighborhood they truly wanted Oakwood Estates to be. The Oakwood Estates Community Center, normally host to yoga classes and book clubs, had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom. Rows of chairs faced a long table, where Thomas Reynolds sat with the remaining HOA board members, his decades on the bench evident in his commanding presence. The room had reached capacity 30 minutes before the scheduled start, with residents spilling into the hallway straining to hear the proceedings. Marcus sat in the second row beside his Aunt Vivian, acutely aware of the eyes that occasionally darted in his direction, some curious, some supportive, some openly hostile. Diane Chen occupied the seat on his other side, her usual immaculate presentation slightly frayed at the edges after days of managing the bistro through its unexpected notoriety. Across the aisle, Karen Whitfield sat perfectly straight, a study in composed defiance. James Patterson flanked her left side, his expression thunderous. The empty seat to her right, where Zoe would normally have been, spoke volumes. At precisely 7 p.m., Thomas tapped his gavel, bringing the murmuring room to silence. This emergency session of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association will now come to order, he announced, his judicial voice requiring no amplification to reach the back of the room. As acting chair in this matter, I will establish ground rules before we proceed. He looked out over the assembled residents, making eye contact with various factions. Each speaker will be given 3 minutes, uninterrupted. Personal attacks will not be tolerated. Our goal is not to vilify individuals but to address behaviors and policies that affect our community. James Patterson snorted audibly at this, earning a sharp look from Thomas. We will begin by reviewing the incident that precipitated this meeting, Thomas continued. Multiple recordings exist, and in the interest of transparency, we will view the most complete version. A screen descended from the ceiling, and Michael Okafor stepped forward with the tablet. I've compiled the footage from 3 separate recordings into a single chronological document. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, explained, his technical expertise evident in his methodical approach. Nothing has been edited except to synchronize the timeline and improve audio clarity. As the video began to play, Marcus felt a strange dissociation watching himself on screen, his professional demeanor, his measured responses to Karen's escalating hostility. The recording captured everything. Karen's initial indignation at being corrected about pool hours, the rapid escalation to demands for Marcus's termination, her damning comments about people like him affecting property values, and finally, his own eloquent response citing restaurant policy and anti-discrimination laws. The room remained silent throughout the playback, the weight of witnessing making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. When the screen went dark, the silence persisted for several long seconds. Mrs. Whitfield, Thomas finally said, as the central party in this incident, you have the first opportunity to address the community. Karen rose with practiced dignity, smoothing her immaculate blazer as she approached the podium. She surveyed the room, visibly cataloging allies and adversaries before speaking. What you've just watched lacks critical context, she began, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. That evening had already been exceptionally stressful. Earlier that day, I'd received concerning news about property assessments in our community. I was hosting important discussions with fellow HOA members about protecting our investments, all of our investments. She emphasized this point with a sweeping gesture that included the entire room. When Marcus interrupted our conversation to contradict me about pool regulations that I myself helped establish, it felt intentionally undermining. My reaction, while perhaps stronger than ideal, came from a place of genuine concern for our community standards. A murmur rippled through the audience. Karen pressed on. I have devoted 14 years to maintaining the quality of life in Oakwood Estates. I have sacrificed countless hours to ensure our community remains the kind of place where people want to live, where families feel safe, where property values continue to appreciate. Her voice strengthened with practiced conviction. If certain words I spoke in the heat of the moment have been misconstrued as discriminatory, I regret that misinterpretation. But I categorically reject the characterization of myself or my actions as racist. James Patterson began applauding, though few joined him. The isolated sound of his clapping only highlighted the community's fracturing support. Thomas nodded neutrally. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Johnson, would you care to respond? Marcus stood, buttoning his suit jacket, a habit from moot court competitions that had become second nature in moments of tension. As he approached the podium, he felt the familiar calm of the courtroom settle over him. Thank you, Judge Reynolds, he began. I appreciate the opportunity to address the community directly, rather than through the filter of viral videos and news headlines. He looked around the room, making brief eye contact with various residents. I want to be clear that my purpose tonight isn't to vilify Mrs. Whitfield or demand personal retribution. What happened at the bistro reflects broader patterns that deserve honest examination. Karen shifted in her seat, visibly bracing for attack. Marcus surprised her by changing direction. Oakwood Estates is objectively a beautiful community, with well-maintained facilities and impressive property values. The question before us isn't whether these qualities are desirable. They certainly are. The question is whether preserving these qualities requires exclusionary practices and coded language about who belongs and who doesn't. He paused, letting the point settle. When I politely corrected Mrs. Whitfield about the pool hours, information that affected not just her planned gathering, but also my right as a resident to access community facilities, the response wasn't simple embarrassment or even irritation. It was indignation that someone like me would dare correct someone like her. That reaction reveals assumptions about hierarchy and belonging that extend far beyond a single misunderstanding about pool regulations. James Patterson stood abruptly. This is absurd. He's taking a simple customer service dispute and twisting it into some grand statement about society. We're here to discuss a specific incident, not rewrite the social contract of Oakwood Estates. Mr. Patterson, Thomas said firmly, please respect the ground rules. Mr. Johnson has the floor. James remained standing, his face flushed. So we're just supposed to sit quietly while the very foundations of our community are attacked? While everything we've built here is painted as somehow shameful? James, Thomas warned, his gavel raised. This is exactly the problem, James continued, gesturing expansively. You can't even defend traditional values anymore without being labeled a bigot. All we want is to maintain the standards that have made Oakwood what it is. A new voice cut through the tension, firm, female, and unexpected. And what exactly are those standards, Mr. Patterson? All heads turned toward the back of the room where Zoe Whitfield stood, having slipped in unnoticed during the video presentation. Her mother's face registered shock as Zoe moved forward, her steps deliberate. As she approached the center aisle, Is it landscaping requirements, architectural review processes, or is it the unwritten rule that certain people don't quite fit the community profile? Zoe continued, quoting a phrase she'd heard at countless HOA meetings. Because I grew up hearing the discussions that happened after board meetings, in our living room at dinner parties during neighborhood gatherings. I know exactly what maintaining standards has often meant in practice. Karen half rose from her seat. Zoe, this isn't appropriate. It's exactly appropriate, Mom, Zoe replied, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. If we're having an honest conversation about our community, then we need to acknowledge the things that have been said behind closed doors. The room had gone completely still, the family drama unfolding before them, exposing the community's larger fault lines. Please continue, Ms. Whitfield, Thomas said gently. Zoe looked around the room, making eye contact with neighbors she'd known her entire life. I've heard comments about keeping the character of Oakwood intact, about cultural fit and community. Harmony. Always in the most polite terms, always with plausible deniability. But the message was clear. Some people belong here and others don't. She paused, gathering courage. What happened at the bistro simply brought that subtext into the open. James Patterson had remained standing, his isolation growing more apparent, as even his supporters seemed to shrink from his increasingly belligerent stance. This is nothing but emotional manipulation, he declared. Bringing family drama into a community governance issue is completely inappropriate. With respect, Mr. Patterson, Michael Okafor interjected, rising from his seat with tablet in hand. Perhaps we might benefit from examining some objective data rather than trading accusations. Thomas nodded gratefully. Please proceed, Mr. Okafor. Michael connected his tablet to the projection system, displaying a series of graphs and charts. As someone who analyzes market trends professionally, I took the liberty of compiling some relevant data on property values and community diversity. He clicked through several slides, explaining each methodically. The data is quite clear. Diverse communities with inclusive governance structures actually experience stronger property value appreciation over time compared to demographically homogeneous enclaves. Another slide appeared, showing comparative statistics from similar communities across the state. Furthermore, diverse communities demonstrate greater resilience during market downturns and faster recovery patterns. James scoffed. Cherry-picked statistics to support a predetermined conclusion. These findings have been replicated in multiple peer-reviewed studies across different regions, Michael countered calmly. The economic benefits of diversity are well established in urban planning literature. I'm happy to provide full citations and methodology notes to anyone interested. The presentation had shifted the atmosphere in the room, subtly but meaningfully, by reframing inclusion as economically advantageous rather than merely morally necessary. Michael had reached residents who might have been resistant to purely ethical arguments. Thomas cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Okafor. At this time, I'd like to open the floor to other community members who wish to speak. What followed was unprecedented in Oakwood Estates history, a public forum where previously silent voices finally found expression. An Indian American doctor described the coincidental delays in his application process 4 years earlier. A Latino family recounted how neighborhood children mysteriously stopped, including their kids in playdates after Karen became HOA president. An elderly Black resident who had lived in Oakwood since its founding shared how she had been repeatedly mistaken for household staff by newer residents. With each testimony, Karen seemed to physically diminish in her chair, the accumulated weight of experiences she had dismissed or denied pressing down upon her carefully constructed narrative. James continued to interject occasionally, but his interruptions grew increasingly isolated and ineffective as the community's mood crystallized against him. After nearly 2 hours of testimony, Thomas called for order once more. Based on what we've heard tonight, and in accordance with HOA bylaws regarding conduct unbecoming of an officer, I believe we must address the question of Mrs. Whitfield's continued leadership. Karen straightened, summoning her remaining dignity. I remind the board that removal requires a 2/3 majority vote following formal proceedings. This emergency session does not constitute such proceedings. You are correct regarding the formal removal process, Thomas acknowledged. However, the bylaws also provide for an immediate vote of no confidence, which would temporarily suspend your authority pending formal proceedings. He surveyed the room. I believe we have sufficient cause and quorum present to hold such a vote. James rose again. This is nothing short of a coup, a calculated takeover using a manipulated incident as pretext. The vote will proceed, Thomas stated firmly. All in favor of a motion of no confidence in Karen Whitfield's leadership as HOA President, please raise your hands. Hands rose throughout the room, gradually at first, then in increasing numbers as residents who had long occupied neutral territory finally took a public stand. Even several people who had entered the meeting as Karen's supporters reluctantly raised their hands, the accumulated evidence too compelling to ignore. Thomas counted methodically. The motion passes with 78% in favor. Mrs. Whitfield is suspended from her position as HOA President, effective immediately, pending formal removal proceedings. Karen's face drained of color, but she maintained her rigid posture. I will, of course, challenge this procedural overreach. That is your right, Thomas replied evenly. For now, I will serve as interim president until formal elections can be held. As the meeting began to disperse, Marcus found himself surrounded by residents eager to share their experiences or express support. Through the crowd, he caught sight of Karen standing alone near the exit, her usual entourage notably absent. Even James had disappeared, his final stand having exposed him too clearly to maintain plausible deniability. Zoe approached her mother hesitantly, their conversation hidden from view by the shifting crowd. Whatever passed between them was brief. Zoe's body language suggested an attempt at connection met with resistance. The younger woman eventually turned away, shoulders slumped in resignation. Marcus extricated himself from the well-wishers and made his way toward Zoe, moved by a compassion that surprised him given everything that had transpired. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Zoe gave a short, humorless laugh. I just publicly contributed to my mother's humiliation. All right isn't exactly the word. You told the truth, Marcus corrected gently. That's not the same as humiliation. Try telling her that. Zoe glanced toward the exit where Karen had already disappeared. She thinks I betrayed her. Maybe I did. The community center continued to empty around them, residents breaking into small clusters of animated conversation as they processed the evening's revelations. Diane caught Marcus's eye from across the room and nodded her acknowledgement before slipping out the side door, undoubtedly returning to the bistro to share the outcome with her waiting staff. What happens now? Zoe asked, the question encompassing far more than just the HOA leadership transition. Marcus considered his response carefully. The community meeting had provided a necessary public reckoning, but true change would require more than a single evening of testimony and a leadership change. That depends, he finally said, on what kind of community Oakwood Estates decides to become, and whether this moment leads to real change or just a different face on the same policies. Zoe studied him intently. And for you? Will you pursue legal action against her? Against the HOA? The question crystallized the decision Marcus had been wrestling with since the incident, whether justice in this case required formal legal consequences or community accountability. As a future civil rights attorney, he believed in the power of the law to create systemic change, but he also recognized that true transformation required more than legal victories. I'm still deciding, he admitted. There's a larger conversation we need to have about restoration versus punishment, about how communities heal after confronting uncomfortable truths. Zoe nodded slowly, understanding the implications that extended far beyond her mother's suspended presidency. The empty clubhouse around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from this moment of reckoning. Not just for Karen Whitfield and Marcus Johnson, but for Oakwood Estates itself. Steam rose from Marcus's cup as he sat. In the corner of Percolate, the independently owned coffee shop that served as Oakwood's alternative to the chain cafes dotting the commercial district. He'd chosen this spot deliberately for its neutral territory, neither the bistro where he'd become something of a reluctant celebrity, nor any of the formal community spaces where the aftermath of the HOA meeting continued to reverberate. He spread his constitutional law notes across the small table, attempting to reclaim some normalcy amid the 7 days of upheaval that had followed the community reckoning. His phone, set to silent, occasionally illuminated with notifications. Another media request, another message from a law firm interested in representing him. Another community member sharing their story of exclusion at Oakwood. The bell above the door chimed and Marcus glanced up reflexively, then straightened as Zoe Whitfield entered. She paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room until her gaze settled on him. After a moment's hesitation, she approached his table. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her voice carrying a forced casualness. Marcus closed his textbook. "It's all yours." Zoe set down her bag and coat before heading to the counter to order. She returned carrying a chai latte, settling across from him with a deep exhale that seemed to release a week's worth of tension. "I've been looking for you," she admitted. "Not in a stalker way, I just wanted to talk, away from everyone else's expectations and opinions." "I've been lying low," Marcus acknowledged, trying to focus on finals while juggling everything else. "Do you regret standing your ground that night?" The question came softly, without judgment. "No," Marcus replied without hesitation. "But I do sometimes wonder about the cost, for everyone involved." A flicker of pain crossed Zoe's features. "Including my mother?" "Including your mother," he confirmed. "Despite everything, I don't believe public humiliation creates lasting change. It might force accountability in the moment, but true transformation requires something deeper." Zoe studied him for a long moment. "You're not what she expected, you know. After that night at the bistro when she was building her defense narrative, she kept talking about you as this angry, aggressive person with an agenda, even when the video clearly showed otherwise." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "It's a common reaction. When someone's worldview is challenged, it's easier to distort reality than to reconsider deeply held beliefs." "There's something I think you should know about my mother," Zoe said, leaning forward, not to excuse what she did, but maybe to understand it. Marcus set aside his coffee, giving her his full attention. "My mother grew up poor, truly poor. Rural Kentucky, trailer park, food stamps poor." Zoe's voice softened. "She never talks about it. I only know because my grandmother mentioned it once before Mom shut the conversation down completely. She reinvented herself in her 20s, changed her accent, her clothes, her entire persona. Worked in real estate during the housing boom. Married my father who came from old money." Zoe's fingers twisted around her napkin. "When he left us for his much younger assistant 8 years ago, something broke in her. She channeled everything into securing our place in Oakwood. Like if she controlled every aspect of the community perfectly enough, we could never be ejected from it." Marcus absorbed this context thoughtfully. That explains some of her ferocity, about standards and belonging. She climbed out of one world into another and she's terrified of falling back, Zoe affirmed. "It doesn't justify how she treats people, but it helps explain the desperation behind it," Marcus finished. "When belonging feels precarious, the instinct to draw boundaries becomes stronger." Their conversation paused as the door chimed again. Karen Whitfield herself stood framed in the entrance, her normally impeccable appearance slightly diminished, hair still perfect but eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She froze upon seeing Marcus and Zoe together, her expression cycling rapidly, through shock, hurt, and finally, a careful neutrality. After a moment's hesitation, she turned and left without ordering, the bell signaling her retreat. That's the third time this week she's left somewhere rather than share space with people from the community, Zoe said quietly. She's becoming a ghost in her own neighborhood. "Is she staying with you?" Marcus asked. Zoe shook her head. "I've tried to talk to her, but she's not ready. She's convinced this is a temporary setback, that people will come to their senses once the emotion dies down. She met Marcus's gaze directly. The law firms have been contacting her too, with warning letters. The unspoken question hung between them. "I've made my decision about legal action," Marcus said, watching her expression carefully. "I'm not filing a lawsuit against your mother or the HOA. Relief washed across Zoe's features, followed quickly by confusion. "Why not? You'd almost certainly win. My mother's words are on video. There are dozens of witnesses. Because a lawsuit would satisfy legal justice but miss the opportunity for community healing," Marcus explained. "I've been talking with my aunt about alternatives that create lasting change, rather than just punishment." "What kind of alternatives?" "I'm meeting with Thomas Reynolds and Michael Okafor this afternoon to discuss a community initiative, one that would establish scholarships for minority law students interested in housing and discrimination law, funded by Oakwood Estates." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Instead of extracting financial damages through the courts, we can channel resources toward addressing the systemic issues that allowed this situation to develop in the first place." Zoe considered this thoughtfully. "That's not what most people would do in your position." "I didn't go to law school to win cases," Marcus said simply. "I went to create change." Across town at the bistro, Diane Chen stood before her assembled staff. The restaurant closed for their first-ever all-hands training session. The familiar dining room had been rearranged, tables pushed together to form a large conference setting, where servers, kitchen staff, hosts, and management sat together as equals. "For 15 years, I've prided myself on running an establishment that serves excellent food in an elegant atmosphere," Diane began, her voice steady despite her evident discomfort with public speaking. "But recent events have forced me to recognize that excellence isn't just about what's on the plate or how quickly it arrives at the table. It's about the dignity afforded to every person who works and dines here." Shanice sat near the front, her usual vibrant energy tempered by the seriousness of the occasion. Beside her, other staff members, particularly those from minority backgrounds, nodded in subtle acknowledgement of truths long felt but rarely discussed openly. "Today marks the first of our monthly diversity and inclusion training sessions," Diane continued, gesturing to a woman who stood nearby. "Dr. Rosario is an expert in workplace equity and will be helping us develop concrete policies and practices to ensure the bistro becomes a model for other businesses in our community." As the session began, Diane moved to sit beside Shanice. "Thank you," Shanice said quietly, "for finally hearing us." Diane's expression reflected both remorse and resolve. "I should have listened sooner. I convinced myself that neutrality was the safest path for everyone, when in reality it just protected me from having to take a stand." "What happens when she comes back?" Shanice asked, both of them knowing exactly who she referred to. "Karen Whitfield will be welcome to dine at the bistro," Diane replied carefully, "under the same conditions as any other patron, with respect for our staff and policies. No exceptions, no special treatment, no looking the other way." Shanice studied her boss with newfound respect. "You've changed." "We all have," Diane replied. "The question is whether those changes will last." In the Oakwood Estates Community Center, Thomas Reynolds and Michael Okafor sat surrounded by papers and laptop screens, deep in conversation about HOA bylaw revisions when Marcus arrived. "Gentlemen," he greeted them, setting his materials on the table. "I appreciate you making time for this discussion." "Your proposal intrigued us both," Thomas replied. "A scholarship fund as an alternative to litigation is an innovative approach. I've drafted a proposal for the Oakwood Estates Community Justice Scholarship, an annual fund supporting law students focusing on housing equality and anti-discrimination work," Marcus explained, opening his portfolio. "It would be funded by the HOA directly through annual dues, plus initial contributions from board members and community fundraising events." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "It addresses the harm caused without creating further division, and it establishes a lasting commitment, rather than a one-time settlement that might be forgotten." "Exactly," Marcus affirmed. The goal isn't just accountability for what happened at the bistro, but transformation of the underlying community structures that made it possible. What about Karen? Thomas asked carefully. How does she fit into this vision of restorative justice? Marcus had anticipated this question. I believe genuine restoration requires acknowledgement of harm caused, not just financial contribution. If Mrs. Whitfield is willing to participate in community dialogue sessions and contribute meaningfully to the scholarship fund's establishment, I would consider that a more productive outcome than court-mandated penalties. And if she refuses, Michael pressed. Then the legal option remains available, Marcus acknowledged. But my hope is that we can create a path that allows for accountability with dignity for everyone involved. In a spacious living room across the community, James Patterson paced before a dwindling audience of supporters. What had been intended as a strategy session to restore traditional leadership to the HOA had devolved into a gathering of just 7 residents, most of them from the oldest generation of Oakwood homeowners. This scholarship proposal is nothing but extortion dressed up as charity, James declared, his face flushed with indignation. They're forcing us to fund their political agenda or face lawsuits. An elderly resident raised his hand tentatively. I've reviewed the proposal Thomas sent out. It actually seems quite reasonable, supporting education rather than paying damages. And my grandson tells me the changes to the bylaws are just making explicit what federal housing law already requires. James waved this away impatiently. That's how they get you, making reasonable-sounding requests while fundamentally altering the character of our community. Give in on this, and next, they'll be demanding we convert the tennis courts to basketball or replace the clubhouse with low-income
housing.
The hyperbolic slippery slope argument hung awkwardly in the air. Even James's remaining supporters exchanged uncomfortable glances. My property values have actually increased by 3% since all this started, another resident observed, mildly. My real estate agent says there's renewed interest in Oakwood from young professionals specifically because of the community's progressive evolution. James stared at them in disbelief. So you're all just going to capitulate? Watch while everything we've built here is dismantled in the name of some vague notion of inclusion? Change isn't dismantling, James, the elderly resident replied gently. Sometimes it's just change. One by one, the remaining attendees made polite excuses and departed, leaving James alone with his grievances and a living room full of untouched refreshments. As evening fell over Oakwood Estates, Karen Whitfield sat alone on her back patio, a glass of wine untouched beside her as she stared out at the carefully landscaped garden she had once showcased during community garden tours. Her phone lay silent. No calls from HOA members seeking her opinion, no invitations to charity functions, no neighbors asking for her approval on renovation plans. The doorbell rang, startling her from her reverie. She hesitated before answering. Having grown accustomed to journalists seeking comment or former friends delivering awkward explanations of why they couldn't associate with her publicly, Zoe stood on the doorstep, a folder tucked under her arm. "Mom," she said simply, "can I come in?" Karen stepped back wordlessly, allowing her daughter to enter the home that had once served as the unofficial HOA headquarters and social hub of Oakwood Estates. "I brought something I thought you should see," Zoe said, following her mother to the kitchen where she set the folder on the counter. "It's Marcus Johnson's proposal for resolving the situation without a lawsuit." Karen's expression hardened. "So now he's dictating terms?" "He's offering an alternative," Zoe corrected gently. "One that focuses on making things right rather than punishment." "And what exactly does making things right entail?" Karen asked, not touching the folder. "A community scholarship fund for law students studying housing discrimination, revised HOA bylaws with clear anti-discrimination language, and community dialogue sessions." Zoe paused. "He's not asking for personal damages, Mom. He's not trying to humiliate you further." Karen's hand trembled slightly as she finally reached for the folder, opening it to scan the contents. Her expression remained carefully neutral as she read, but Zoe could see the surprise registering in subtle ways. "Why would he do this?" Karen finally asked, looking up from the proposal. He could easily win a substantial settlement. Because he cares more about creating change than winning, Zoe replied simply. He told me something today that made me think of you, actually. He said when belonging feels precarious, the instinct to draw boundaries becomes stronger. Karen stiffened. You told him about my background. I did, Zoe acknowledged without apology. Not to excuse what happened, but to help him understand. I don't need his understanding or his pity, Karen said sharply. It's not pity, Mom, it's perspective. Zoe's voice remained gentle but firm. You fought so hard to belong in this world that you ended up building walls against anyone you thought might threaten it. But those walls have left you isolated, even before what happened at the bistro. Karen turned away, unwilling to let her daughter see the emotion that threatened to break through her carefully maintained facade. I built a good life for us. I protected what mattered. I know you did, Zoe said, moving to stand beside her mother. Nobody's questioning how hard you worked or how much you sacrificed, but somewhere along the way, protecting our place in Oakwood became more important than the values that should have defined that place. They stood in silence for several long moments, the proposal lying open between them. Not just a legal alternative, but an invitation to a different kind of resolution. There's a community dialogue session tomorrow evening, Zoe finally said. I'm going. You could come with me. Karen's instinctive refusal rose to her lips but remained unspoken as she considered the lonely days stretching behind and before her. The empire she had built within Oakwood Estates had crumbled, leaving her with a choice: retreat behind ever higher walls, or begin the uncomfortable work of building bridges instead. I'll think about it, she said quietly. The smallest possible opening, but an opening nonetheless. As night settled over Oakwood Estates, Marcus sat on the small porch of his aunt's guest house, watching the community's lights twinkle in the distance. His phone vibrated with a text from Zoe. She read the proposal, didn't say no to the dialogue session. Progress? He smiled slightly as he typed his response. Progress. The past week had revealed possibilities he hadn't anticipated when he'd first stood his ground at the bistro, not just for accountability but for genuine connection across lines that had seemed impermeable. The transformation was still fragile, still being tested in 1,000 small interactions throughout the community, but it had begun. From inside the guest house, his aunt called out, "The local news wants to interview you about the scholarship initiative. Tomorrow at the bistro, you interested?" Marcus looked out once more at the lights of Oakwood, no longer representing an exclusive enclave defined by who it kept out, but a community beginning the long journey toward defining itself by who it welcomed in. Yes, he called back. I think that's exactly where we need to be. The bistro glowed with warmth on a crisp autumn evening, its elegant interior transformed for the occasion. Where white tablecloths usually dominated, tonight featured standing, cocktail tables interspersed with comfortable seating arrangements designed to encourage conversation. A banner stretched across one wall declared, "Inaugural Oakwood Estates Justice in Housing Scholarship Fundraiser." 6 months had passed since the confrontation that had forced an entire community to examine its unspoken rules and implicit biases. Now the same restaurant that had witnessed that painful reckoning hosted its celebration of growth, imperfect and ongoing, but undeniably real. Marcus Johnson, dressed in a tailored suit rather than a server's uniform, surveyed the crowded room with quiet satisfaction. His final semester of law school was nearly complete, bar exam preparations well underway, and tonight represented a milestone in the journey that had begun with a simple correction about pool hours. We've already exceeded our initial funding. Goal, Vivian Johnson reported, joining her nephew with a glass of sparkling water in hand. Thomas just received another 5-figure pledge from the Hendersons. Who would have thought they'd become such enthusiastic supporters? Marcus smiled. People can surprise you when given the chance. His gaze traveled across the room, taking in the diverse gathering that would have been unimaginable in Oakwood Estates just months before. Diane Chen moved confidently among her former patrons, now partners in community transformation rather than just customers to be appeased. Michael, Okafor engaged a group of real estate developers in animated conversation about inclusive housing design. Shanice, wearing the blazer that marked her recent promotion to assistant manager, directed the servers with the assured authority of someone who knew her value was recognized, and in a corner that offered partial privacy while still remaining part of the gathering, Karen Whitfield sat with Thomas Reynolds reviewing notes for her upcoming remarks. Her posture remained elegantly straight, her clothing impeccable, but subtle changes were evident to those who looked closely. The slightly softer expression, the more attentive listening, the absence of the rigid control that had once defined her presence. "Still can't quite believe she agreed to co-host," Vivian murmured following Marcus's gaze. "It wasn't an easy decision for her," Marcus acknowledged, "but that's what makes it meaningful." The journey to this evening had been neither simple nor linear. The community dialogue sessions had started small and often tense, with Karen attending, the first one only after 3 cancellations. Her initial participation had been marked by defensive justifications, thinly disguised as apologies. But something had shifted during the 3rd session, when an elderly black resident who had lived in Oakwood since its founding described decades of subtle exclusion with such dignity that Karen had finally fallen silent, really listening perhaps for the first time. The scholarship initiative, initially viewed by some as merely an alternative to litigation, had gradually transformed into a genuine community commitment. What began as Marcus's vision had evolved through input from dozens of residents, including, eventually, Karen herself, whose organizational skills and fundraising connections proved invaluable once she committed to the project. "It's almost time," Diane announced, approaching with a warm smile. "We should get everyone seated for the presentations." As the gathering arranged itself around the small podium, Marcus found himself sharing a table with Zoe Whitfield, whose transformation had perhaps been the most profound of all. In the aftermath of the incident, she had transferred from business school to a social policy program, where she was now researching housing discrimination under Thomas Reynolds's informal mentorship. "Nervous?" she asked, noticing Marcus checking his notes. "A bit," he admitted. "Public speaking still hasn't replaced taking the bar as my greatest fear." "You'll be fine," she assured him. "Just like the community forums. Speak from experience, not theory." Thomas Reynolds approached the podium, his judicial bearing naturally commanding the room's attention, without need for formal announcement. "Good evening, friends and neighbors," he began. 6 months ago, our community faced a painful but necessary reckoning with truths we had too long ignored. Tonight, we celebrate not the completion of that journey, but our commitment to continuing it. He outlined the scholarship program that would support minority law students focusing on housing equity and discrimination law, explaining how it would connect recipients with mentorship opportunities through local firms and community advocacy organizations. "I'm pleased to report that tonight's fundraiser has already exceeded our initial goal of $75,000, with current pledges totaling over $100,000, he announced to enthusiastic applause. "This will fully fund our first 3 scholarship recipients and establish an endowment to ensure the program's sustainability." Thomas then introduced Diane Chen, acknowledging her critical role in both the catalyst event and the healing process that followed. Diane stepped forward, her natural reserve still evident but overshadowed by newfound confidence. "The bistro has always prided itself on excellence," she began. "But recent months have taught us that true excellence means more than perfect food and elegant surroundings. It means creating a space where dignity and respect are afforded to every person, whether they're serving or being served." She described the changes implemented at the bistro, not just anti-discrimination training but structural shifts in hiring, promotion practices, and community engagement. Most significantly, she announced a partnership with Michael Okafor to create employment pathways for residents from underrepresented communities. "And I'm especially proud to announce that Shanice Williams will be taking over day-to-day management of the bistro starting next month," Diane concluded, gesturing toward Shanice, who stood to acknowledge the announcement with a dignified nod. Each speaker added another thread to the tapestry of transformation, Michael outlining the revised HOA bylaws that explicitly prohibited discrimination and established clear review processes for complaints. Vivian describing the legal clinic that would open at the community center. Shanice sharing her vision for the bistro as a truly inclusive gathering place. Then came the moment many had been curious about, some skeptical of, and others hopeful for. Karen Whitfield approached the podium, her steps measured, her expression composed but lacking the impervious shield she had once worn like armor. A subtle hush fell over the room. Despite months of community dialogue sessions and committee work, this marked Karen's first truly public address since her removal from the HOA presidency. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I stand before you today not as the person I was 6 months ago, but as someone in the process of becoming someone better." She paused, and Marcus could see the careful consideration behind each word, not the calculated performance of the past, but genuine effort to communicate authentically. What happened at the bistro last spring was not a momentary lapse of judgment, on my part. It was the culmination of attitudes and assumptions I had harbored and perpetuated for years. Karen's gaze moved across the room, not avoiding the faces of those she had once dismissed or excluded. I used terms like community standards and property values as shields against change and as weapons against those I perceived as threats to my position. The honesty was striking, lacking both the defensive qualifications of her earlier quasi-apologies and the performative self-flagellation that sometimes characterized public mea culpas. "My journey these past months has been humbling and often uncomfortable," she continued. "I've had to confront not just what I said that evening, but the years of smaller moments that made that confrontation inevitable. I've had to recognize how my own insecurities about belonging led me to zealously guard the boundaries of who could belong here." Karen's gaze found Zoe, who offered a small, encouraging nod. "I cannot undo the harm my actions caused, to individuals, and to this community. But I can commit to the ongoing work of change, not just in words or donations, but in daily choices and challenging conversations." She straightened slightly. "The scholarship program we celebrate tonight represents one tangible step in that commitment. I'm grateful to Marcus Johnson and others who chose a path of restoration rather than simple retribution, creating the possibility for growth rather than just punishment." As Karen concluded her remarks, the applause that followed was neither the automatic response of social obligation nor the enthusiastic endorsement of complete forgiveness. It was something more nuanced, an acknowledgement of difficult work begun, of accountability accepted, of change that required continued effort rather than a single moment of revelation. Marcus was the final speaker, his legal training evident in the clear structure of his presentation as he outlined his post-graduation plans to join a firm specializing in housing discrimination law while maintaining his connection to the Oakwood Initiative. What happened 6 months ago was never just about one incident or one person, he emphasized. It reflected systemic patterns that exist far beyond our community. The scholarship program and policy changes we've implemented here represent important steps, but they're just the beginning of a longer journey. He described his vision for Oakwood Estates becoming a model for other communities, not by achieving perfect inclusion overnight, but by honestly confronting exclusionary patterns and creating sustainable mechanisms for change. Transformative. Justice isn't about punishment or performative gestures, Marcus concluded. It's about creating new systems that make old harms less likely to recur. It's about acknowledging that healing is an ongoing process, not a single event. Most importantly, it's about recognizing our shared humanity across lines that once seemed impermeable. As the formal program concluded, and the gathering transitioned to informal conversation, Marcus found himself momentarily alone at the edge of the room, observing the connections forming among people who might never have meaningfully interacted before the catalyst event. "A remarkable evening," Thomas Reynolds commented, joining him with coffee in hand, though not without its absences. They both knew he was referring to James Patterson, who had sold his home 2 months earlier, declaring Oakwood Estates unrecognizable and retreating to a gated community in another state. A handful of other residents had followed, unable or unwilling to adapt to the community's evolution. "Change is never universal," Marcus acknowledged. but the momentum seems sustainable. Now, indeed. Thomas nodded toward where Zoe stood deep in conversation with Michael Okafor and several younger residents who had recently formed a community outreach committee. The next generation gives me hope. As the evening began to wind down, Marcus found himself face to face with Karen as they both reached for coat check tickets. It was the closest they had been since the confrontation 6 months earlier, despite working on the same initiative. "Your speech was excellent," Karen said after a moment's hesitation. "Clear, compelling, without unnecessary embellishment." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "Yours took courage." Karen's lips pressed together briefly. "Less courage than facing oneself honestly, I've discovered." She hesitated, then added, "I never would have predicted this outcome that night at the bistro." "Nor I," Marcus acknowledged. "Was it worth it?" she asked suddenly. "All of this?" She gestured to encompass the scholarship program, the community changes, the personal upheaval. "Instead of the lawsuit you could have pursued?" Marcus considered the question seriously. Legal victories create important precedents, but they rarely change hearts or build community. This was harder in many ways, but yes, I believe it was worth it. Karen nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to think so too. It wasn't friendship or even complete resolution. Too much history and hurt remained for such simple closure. But in that brief exchange lay the recognition of their unlikely connection through conflict, how their confrontation had catalyzed changes neither could have anticipated, creating ripples that continued to transform an entire community. As guests departed and the bistro staff began the quiet rhythm of closing, Diane approached Marcus with a smile. "Full circle," she observed. "From that Friday night service shift to tonight." Marcus looked around the restaurant, the same elegant space where he had once balanced plates and navigated social hierarchy, now transformed into something both familiar and profoundly different. "Not quite a circle," he corrected gently, "more of a spiral. We've returned to this place, but at a different level." Outside, the lights of Oakwood Estates glowed against the evening sky. The same beautiful community it had always been, with its manicured landscapes and elegant homes. But beneath that unchanged exterior, the foundations had shifted. New conversations had begun. Different voices were being heard. The work remained incomplete, the transformation ongoing, but unmistakably underway. The journey toward true inclusion had only just begun, but for the first time the path forward was visible to all who chose to see it. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.